The pattern emerged slowly, a statistical anomaly that might have been dismissed as coincidence if not for the persistence of a data analyst working in the U.S. Marshals Service's Fugitive Tracking Division. Over an 18-month period, 27 high-priority fugitives had vanished from surveillance in the southwestern United States, specifically in cities within 200 miles of the Mexican border. Each disappearance followed similar circumstances. Active investigation suddenly went cold. Witnesses reported seeing the fugitive days before they vanished. And then nothing. No border crossing records, no financial transactions, no communication intercepts. They simply ceased to exist in any database law enforcement could access. The analyst presented findings to supervisors, who initially attributed the pattern to Mexico's vast territory and limited cooperation between some regional authorities and U.S. law enforcement. Fugitives crossing into Mexico was not unusual. The border's length and the difficulty of tracking individuals who disappeared into cities like Tijuana or Juarez made pursuit challenging. But this pattern showed unusual sophistication. The fugitives weren't simply running across the border. They were disappearing before reaching it, suggesting they had help from someone who understood how law enforcement tracked fleeing criminals. A task force was established to investigate what was being called the Southwest Pipeline. The name reflected investigators' belief that fugitives were being moved through an organized system rather than escaping individually through luck or skill. U.S. Marshals took the lead, coordinating with FBI agents specializing in public corruption and DEA personnel who had sources in border communities. The investigation began by examining each of the 27 fugitives, looking for connections or patterns that might reveal who was helping them disappear. The first break came from financial analysis. Several fugitives had withdrawn large cash sums in the days before vanishing, amounts ranging from $50,000 to $300,000. The withdrawals occurred at different banks in different cities, but timing suggested payment for services rather than simply grabbing money before fleeing. Someone was charging fees to move fugitives, and those fees were substantial enough to indicate professional operation rather than opportunistic assistance. Surveillance of likely extraction points began. Marshals identified locations where fugitives might be handed off to whoever was running the pipeline. Parking lots near interstate highways, truck stops, rest areas. Teams monitored these locations, documenting vehicles and individuals, building databases of patterns. The work was tedious and often fruitless, but eventually, patterns emerged. Certain vehicles appeared repeatedly at locations where fugitives had last been seen. License plates traced to rental companies or individuals with no apparent criminal history, but connections to law enforcement or legal professions. The revelation that current or former law enforcement might be involved transformed the investigation. Internal affairs divisions were brought in to examine personnel records and financial disclosures. The scope expanded to include defense attorneys, bail bondsmen, and court officials who might have access to information about fugitives and pending warrants. The investigation had to proceed carefully, as any leak to corrupt insiders would alert them and allow the pipeline to shut down or relocate operations. Investigators identified a former police detective who had retired from the San Diego Police Department 5 years earlier. His retirement had been unremarkable, concluding a 22-year career with adequate but not exceptional performance reviews. But financial records showed he was living far beyond what his pension could support. He owned property in 3 states, drove expensive vehicles, and made frequent trips to Mexico. Surveillance teams began monitoring his movements, documenting contacts, and attempting to identify his role in the pipeline. The former detective operated carefully, using counter-surveillance techniques that indicated he was aware law enforcement might be watching. He varied his routes, checked for following vehicles, and conducted meetings in locations that made electronic surveillance difficult. But Marshals had resources and patience. They tracked his movements through cell phone tower data, identified associates through financial connections, and slowly built a picture of how the pipeline functioned. The network included 2 defense attorneys who represented clients facing serious charges. These attorneys had access to detailed information about prosecution strategies, witness lists, and law enforcement plans. They passed this information to the former detective, who used it to determine optimal timing for fugitive extraction, when a client was likely to be convicted, or when arrest appeared imminent. The attorneys would arrange introduction to the detective, who would offer escape services for a fee that typically exceeded $200,000. The detective worked with a document specialist who created false identification, sophisticated enough to pass border security, driver's licenses, passports, birth certificates, all perfectly forged using templates and security features that matched legitimate documents. These materials allowed fugitives to cross into Mexico legally, avoiding the risks associated with illegal border crossings. Once in Mexico, the fugitives were handed off to a network of safe houses operated by a bail bondsman who had built relationships with Mexican contacts during years of tracking clients who fled across the border. The bail bondsman's role was particularly cynical. He had spent a career pursuing fugitives who skipped bail, learning the routes they used, the safe houses they relied on, and the corrupt officials who could be bribed to look the other way. When he retired, he monetized this knowledge by offering the same services to fugitives willing to pay premium prices. He maintained properties in Tijuana, Ensenada, and Mexicali, rotating fugitives between locations to avoid detection while arranging permanent relocation to Central or South American countries with weak extradition enforcement. The task force now had identified key players in the network, but gathering evidence sufficient for prosecution required careful planning. Wiretaps were authorized for the former detective and both attorneys. Surveillance teams documented meetings and financial transactions. Undercover operations were considered but rejected as too risky. These individuals were trained to detect law enforcement deception, and any failed undercover approach would alert the entire network. The breakthrough came when one of the fugitives who had used the pipeline was arrested in Guatemala on unrelated charges. Guatemalan authorities, cooperating with U.S. requests, interrogated him about how he had escaped from California, where he faced murder charges. He described the entire process: contact through his attorney, payment to the former detective, receipt of false documents, crossing into Mexico at San Isidro using a fake passport, and shelter in Tijuana before being moved further south. His testimony provided first-hand account of the pipeline's operations. Armed with this testimony and months of surveillance evidence, federal prosecutors obtained indictments against 11 individuals involved in the network. The charges included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, fraud, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. For the attorneys involved, additional charges included breach of attorney-client privilege and using confidential information to facilitate crimes. The potential sentences ranged from 20 years to to life imprisonment, depending on individual roles and level of involvement. Arrests were coordinated to occur simultaneously, preventing anyone from warning others. Once operations began, tactical teams executed arrest warrants at 6 locations across Southern California in the early morning hours. The former detective was taken into custody at his home in La Jolla without incident. Both attorneys were arrested at their offices before court hours. The document specialist was apprehended at a print shop where he produced false identification documents. Lower-level operatives who served as drivers and spotters were arrested throughout the day as they were identified and located. The bail bondsman proved more difficult to apprehend. He had been in Mexico when arrests began and was warned by someone before marshals could coordinate his detention with Mexican authorities. A fugitive warrant was issued and Interpol distributed a red notice. But the bondsman had spent years learning how to disappear in Mexico, and he used that knowledge to evade capture. Marshals worked with Mexican federal police to track his movements, but he stayed ahead of pursuit, moving between safe houses he had established for clients and using the same corrupt contacts to avoid arrest. The prosecution of network members proceeded even as the bondsman remained at large. The former detective, facing overwhelming evidence and potential life sentence, agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony detailed the network's operations, confirming everything investigators had learned through surveillance and providing additional information about fugitives who had been moved through the pipeline. He identified corrupt border officials who had been bribed to wave through fugitives using false documents, adding their names to the expanding investigation. Both attorneys fought the charges, arguing that their communications with clients were privileged and that they had not knowingly participated in criminal conspiracy. But recorded conversations captured them discussing specific fugitives and coordinating with the detective about extraction timing. Financial records showed they received substantial payments shortly after fugitives disappeared, money that could not be explained as legitimate legal fees. The evidence was conclusive, and both were convicted after trials that lasted 3 weeks each. The document specialist pleaded guilty and received a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. He explained his methods, showing investigators how he obtained templates and security features needed to create convincing false documents. His operation had produced identification for hundreds of criminals over a decade, earning him millions of dollars while enabling fugitives to escape justice. His cooperation allowed authorities to identify additional clients and trace their current locations, resulting in secondary arrests as fugitives were tracked to various countries. The bail bondsman remained free for 8 months after the initial arrests. He moved through Mexico and Central America, using resources he had accumulated during years of operating the pipeline. But his options narrowed as former associates were arrested and his safe houses were identified and monitored. Mexican authorities, under pressure from U.S. law enforcement and motivated by their own interest in dismantling criminal networks, intensified efforts to locate him. His capture occurred in a small coastal town in Baja California Sur. Acting on intelligence from an informant, Mexican federal police surrounded a vacation rental where the bondsman was staying. He surrendered without resistance, apparently exhausted from months of running and aware that continued flight was futile. Extradition proceedings moved quickly, and within 6 weeks, he was returned to U.S. custody to face charges related to the pipeline operation. At trial, prosecutors presented evidence showing the bondsman had facilitated the escape of 43 fugitives over 5 years, earning approximately $8 million in fees. Each fugitive represented crimes ranging from drug trafficking to murder, criminals who avoided justice because they could pay for sophisticated escape services. The jury convicted him on all counts after deliberating less than 6 hours. The judge sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would never be released. The network's dismantling had cascading effects throughout the criminal justice system. Defense attorneys who had previously recommended the pipeline to clients faced scrutiny from bar associations and law enforcement. Several lost their licenses to practice law. Others became subjects of separate investigations, examining whether they had committed additional crimes beyond those charged in the pipeline case. The legal community in Southern California underwent introspection about ethical boundaries and the responsibilities attorneys owed to justice system. Even while representing clients vigorously, border security protocols were enhanced based on lessons learned from the investigation. The pipeline had exploited weaknesses in document verification processes and relied on corrupt officials who could be bribed to overlook suspicious crossings. New procedures included enhanced authentication technology, randomized inspection protocols that prevented corrupt officials from guaranteeing safe passage, and internal affairs monitoring that made accepting bribes significantly riskier. For the 27 fugitives who had originally prompted the investigation, their freedom was temporary. The former detectives' cooperation provided detailed information about where each had been relocated. International arrest warrants were issued, and marshals worked with law enforcement in 14 countries to locate and apprehend them. Within 2 years, 23 of the 27 were back in U.S. custody, facing the original charges plus additional counts related to fleeing prosecution. The 4 who remained at large had apparently moved beyond the bondsman's network, possibly finding other means of concealment or relocating to countries where extradition was impossible. Their cases remained open, with marshals continuing to pursue leads and monitor intelligence channels. The message was clear. Using the pipeline might provide temporary escape, but it did not guarantee permanent freedom. Law enforcement had long memory and unlimited patience when pursuing fugitives. The task force that investigated the pipeline received commendations for their work. The investigation had required persistence, coordination across multiple agencies, and meticulous attention to detail in gathering evidence against individuals who understood law enforcement procedures intimately. The successful prosecution of network members demonstrated that corruption could be detected and punished regardless of perpetrators' knowledge of investigative techniques. Analysis of the pipeline's operations revealed troubling insights about vulnerabilities in the criminal justice system. The network had operated for years undetected because its members understood how to avoid triggering alarms that would draw investigative attention. They used legitimate channels corrupted for criminal purposes rather than obviously illegal methods. They exploited trust placed in law enforcement and legal professionals, knowing that corruption in those roles was difficult to detect and prove. Reforms extended beyond border security to include enhanced financial monitoring of law enforcement personnel and attorneys who regularly represented clients in serious criminal cases. Unusual wealth or unexplained income triggered automatic reviews. Patterns of clients disappearing before trial prompted investigations into whether attorneys were providing information or assistance to fugitives. The goal was creating an environment where operating a network like the pipeline would be detected earlier. before dozens of fugitives could escape justice. For the communities affected by the fugitives who escaped through the pipeline, the network's dismantling brought mixed emotions. Relief that the system was shut down competed with frustration that it had operated so long undetected. Families of victims whose killers had fled through the pipeline felt betrayed by law enforcement officials and attorneys who prioritized profit over justice. Some filed civil lawsuits against network members, seeking damages for the pain caused by delayed justice. The former detective, serving his reduced sentence in a federal facility, expressed no remorse during interviews with investigators. He described the pipeline as a business opportunity that emerged from his law enforcement experience. He had seen fugitives escape successfully and recognized he could systematize and monetize the process. His cynicism about the justice system, his willingness to help violent criminals avoid accountability, marked him as someone who had fundamentally rejected the values his law enforcement career was supposed to represent. The attorneys who participated in the network received particular condemnation from the legal community. Attorneys are granted special privileges and responsibilities, including access to confidential information and authority to represent clients in court. These privileges exist to ensure robust defense of accused individuals, a cornerstone of the justice system. When attorneys betrayed those privileges by facilitating fugitive flight, they undermined public trust in the entire legal profession. Both were disbarred permanently, their law licenses revoked with findings that they had violated ethical rules in ways that made them unfit to practice. Their convictions meant they could never serve in legal capacities again. Their careers destroyed by choices to prioritize profit over professional obligations. They filed appeals arguing their sentences were excessive, but courts consistently rejected these arguments, finding that their positions of trust made their crimes particularly serious. The document specialist's cooperation revealed connections to other criminal enterprises. His false identification services had been used not just by fugitives, but by human traffickers, drug smugglers, and identity thieves. Additional investigations spawned from his testimony, leading to arrests and prosecutions across multiple states. His particular expertise, creating documents that could pass official scrutiny, made him valuable to various criminal operations, all of which paid premium prices for his services. The bondsman's properties in Mexico were seized through asset forfeiture proceedings. The safe houses where he had sheltered fugitives became evidence in the case against him, their layouts and security features demonstrating the sophistication of his operation. Mexican authorities demolished several of these structures, symbolic gestures intended to demonstrate commitment to preventing similar networks from operating in the future. Years after the pipeline's dismantling, law enforcement remained vigilant for signs that similar networks might be emerging. The incentives that created the original pipeline, fugitives with resources willing to pay for escape services, corrupt individuals willing to risk careers for profit, still existed. Preventing new pipelines required constant monitoring and immediate investigation of suspicious patterns that might indicate organized assistance to fleeing criminals. The investigation's success validated the importance of data analysis in modern law enforcement. The pattern that revealed the pipeline's existence emerged from statistical analysis, not from traditional investigative techniques. This lesson shaped how agencies approached fugitive tracking, with enhanced emphasis on identifying anomalies and patterns that might indicate systematic problems requiring investigation. For the analyst whose work identified the pipeline, The case became a career highlight. She had recognized significance in data that others might have dismissed, pursuing analysis that revealed corruption at the intersection of law enforcement and legal practice. Her persistence ensured that a network facilitating fugitive escape was identified and dismantled, bringing justice to communities affected by the criminals who had briefly escaped accountability. The former detective sits in federal prison, his law enforcement career a distant memory overshadowed by his crimes. He receives occasional visits from investigators, following up on leads related to fugitives, or seeking information about corrupt contacts who might still be active. He provides information selectively, recognizing that cooperation is his only currency in an environment where his former profession makes him a target for violence from inmates who hate law enforcement. The pipeline is gone, its operations ended, and its members imprisoned or disbarred. But the vulnerabilities it exploited remain, requiring constant vigilance to prevent emergence of similar networks. The criminal justice system's reliance on trust that law enforcement will act ethically, that attorneys will honor their obligations, that officials will perform duties faithfully, creates opportunities for corruption that can only be addressed through oversight, accountability, and willingness to investigate even respected professionals when evidence suggests betrayal. In the end, the Southwest Pipeline operated because individuals chose profit over duty, personal gain over justice. Their choices allowed dangerous criminals to escape accountability temporarily, victimizing communities and undermining public faith in law enforcement and legal institutions. Their prosecution and imprisonment restored some measure of faith, demonstrating that corruption would be punished and that those who betrayed their professional obligations would face consequences proportionate to the harm they caused. The fugitives who paid for pipeline services learned that escape was temporary and capture was inevitable. Law enforcement's reach extended across borders. Its memory was institutional rather than individual, and its commitment to justice outlasted any criminal's resources or connections. Some fugitives spent years in foreign countries before being located and returned to face charges. Others were arrested within months. All eventually learned that the pipeline offered false hope. Temporary freedom, purchased at enormous cost and ending in capture, conviction, and imprisonment.